Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be located. And thank you for joining today's panel titled ESG Mandatory Disclosure in the Region, Where Are We? This is Marwa AlMaskati, Director of Marketing and Business Development from Bahrain Bourse. I'd just like to start by thanking our partners at the Arab Federation of Capital Markets for putting together a great lineup of speakers, and also a big thanks to our sponsors, whom without we would have been able to put this together. And I hope you enjoyed yesterday's interesting discussion and looking forward to the remainder of today's discussions. Putting things in context, ESG and sustainability are two sides of one coin. There has been a growing recognition of the role that investors can play in driving changes in companies in which they invest. Investors are increasingly using ESG metrics within their investment processes, not only to assess risk, but also to identify potential real-world impacts, both positive and negative, of corporate operations and future investment opportunities. Today, we stand at crossroads with growing and urgent demand from investors for enhanced ESG reporting, which in turn provides a basis for effective capital allocation decisions. From the perspective of organization, the three main elements of sustainability are target setting, performance management, and reporting. The ESG conversation has moved on from a mere product development to become a conversation linked to the entire ecosystem, in which it aims to address questions such as how the company clearly connects with the outside world through clear reporting and by adopting a holistic strategy. However, disparate reporting frameworks, voluntary guidelines, and often conflicting ESG scores from data providers may be hindering companies and investors' efforts to achieve actual impact. In today's panel discussion, we have brought together an esteemed panel of experts to discuss the recent ESG developments within a regulatory framework and what this means in a post-COP26 landscape, particularly in light of the next upcoming COP28 event to be hosted by an Arab country. I'd like to first introduce our panelist, William Tohmé, CFA, Senior Regional Head of Middle East and North Africa, CFA Institute. Mr. Tohmé is Senior Regional Head of Middle East and North Africa at CFA Institute and is based in the CFA Institute office in Abu Dhabi. Michael Salvatico, Head of Asia Pacific ESG Solutions at S&P Global Sustainable. Michael Salvatico leads the ESG solutions in the Asia Pacific and Middle East Africa for S&P, based in Disney. And for more than 20 years, he has been providing investment solutions for financial markets. And over the last decade, he has focused on sustainable solutions for investors, banks, corporates, regulators, governments, and academics. We also have with us Mariam Madhabi, co-founder and CEO of Value Metrics. Mariam has launched Value Metrics, a specialist analyst provider, with the goal to bring more transparency and engagement between investors and companies and to federate the ESG community. Last but not least, we also have with us Diana Estupian, Head of IR and Capital Markets at Instinctive Partners. Diana is a MENA certified IR consultant and corporate communication specialist with experience in Europe and Middle East and has supported many companies in strengthening their brand by delivering high impact and integrated campaigns and IR programs across sectors and advising boards on ESG issues and stakeholder engagement. So we have up to 30 minutes, including audience Q&A throughout. So let's begin by putting ESG into context. First, let's review the ESG guidelines at Arab exchanges in accordance with WFE and SSE. So I'd like to bring William into the context of this discussion. So William, what are the key trends that you're seeing as far as the policymakers, regulators and exchanges, issuers and investment communities are concerned?
Thank you, Marwa. I'm very glad to be on this esteemed panel. Thanks for the opportunity. I would start by saying that whether national or regional regulations, when we look at regulators in the region and even globally, it is an effort to continue to have a powerful tool to address greenwashing and mainly to protect investors. So when we see all the regulators in the region now trying their best to put the best practices and the best standards when it comes to ESG, the trend is towards really best practices and protecting investors and avoid as much as possible greenwashing. We've seen recently in the press lots of criticism around ESG. I think it makes ESG stronger. It makes ESG a better ethics when it comes to in the investment world and financial markets. So all the criticism we hear around now ESG, especially yesterday, LinkedIn was a bit busy with lots of esteemed investors saying it might be marketing, it might be purely a theme that might disappear after a while. It encouraged me to read more about it yesterday and to take a small part in the conversation and agree that the more criticism we have, the better work we will do to avoid greenwashing and to avoid putting investors' money at risk. Now, let me start with a few numbers I took from the ESG integration in the Arab region done by the Federation of Exchanges. We have 8 Arab stock exchanges that issued written guidance on ESG reporting. We have 2 of them having mandatory reporting regulation. We have 5 exchanges in the Arab world that launched annual sustainability reports. And we have 6 exchanges that offer ESG related training programs. So this is great, but this is good, but we can go from good to great, especially that Arab companies are still unfortunately lagging behind their peers in the world when it comes to ESG performance. We have still poor ESG ranking when we use the, let's call them the mainstream reporting agencies. We are still lagging. Now, to improve this and to improve the rating of the Arab companies, we need to address and understand more seriously about ESG factors. And the exchanges are encouraged to prepare annual sustainability reports and to show their commitment to deliver on the goals and initiatives towards their capital markets. We already have 5. If you allow me, I can list them: ADX, DFM, EGX, BHB, and CSE. The objective here with the annual sustainability report is to really set up sustainability strategy and provide comprehensive information on how various initiatives and practices are ingraining sustainability within the exchange's constituents. So let's go from good to great. Thank you.
Thank you, William, for that. Greenwashing is definitely a theme. And starting with the exchanges, you always start by leading others, but voluntary is not always sufficient. Mandatory sometimes is a requirement. So moving on to Diana, from your perspective as an IR consultant advising companies on IR and ESG topics, what are the issues that you've seen prevalent in the region which may restrict mandating ESG reporting?
Thank you, Marwa. So definitely there has been a lot of progress in the region in kind of issuing guidelines for issuers when it comes to ESG reporting. What we think has been fantastic is that there is a recognition from the exchanges or where issuers are when it comes to their ESG strategies and therefore their reporting. And therefore starting with more of a softer approach by issuing guidelines and starting to prepare companies before we move into hard regulation is the first step and definitely the correct approach. As for some issuers, it's a big undertaking to do ESG properly and to work on a strategy that is science-backed with the correct data and third-party audits in place. So it's fantastic to see those frameworks starting to come in the region. From a company perspective and also for the exchanges, the challenges faced in the region are similar to other markets. And that primarily is related to the reporting universe still being highly fragmented and there's still being a lot of movement when it comes to ESG reporting frameworks. So if there is a hard guideline in place at the moment, there is no guarantee that those reporting frameworks might exist next year. There's a lot of consolidation. So again, from this perspective, kind of taking that soft approach and allowing companies to really look at what framework works best for their sector, for their market, and particularly for their pool of investors is very important. And from a company's perspective, really what is important beyond the regulation is to understand what frameworks asset managers have in place. So what screening mechanisms, for example, some asset managers may look at corruption perception index or the Freedom House index. What exclusions are in place from a sector or an industry perspective, and then what engagement requirements asset managers have in place to really go beyond the regulation and the guidelines that are put in place. So these are some of the elements that from an issuer perspective are important, and then in turn something that as exchanges to provide that supporting framework for issuers, it's important to consider. And just a final point, the silver lining is that investors are not automatically looking to defund companies that are not yet there when it comes to ESG. So issuers and exchanges in the region shouldn't be discouraged, but actually look at how they implement strategies and work with their investors to communicate how they are either decarbonizing or setting themselves for an ESG path with very clear targets and outcomes in place.
Thank you, Diana. Mariam, if you can bring your viewpoint into the context, what's the difference between the European taxonomy and the MENA guidelines impacting the alignment strategy in terms of ESG reporting, particularly given that many issuers have an international mix of investors? In other words, the transition to net zero is already uneven, with different parts of the global economy moving at different speeds. Add to that the various standards and guidelines. What's your take on that?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Marwa, for this question. Actually, I'll jump back to what Diana was saying, is that preparation indeed is necessary before hard law, so to say. Here in Europe, we are already at the era actually of compliance and reporting, because we have SFDR that is already in place. Green taxonomy is here, and social taxonomy is on its way. In a sense, 2021 has been really, we moved from ESG as an opportunity and an alpha generator to ESG is a real compliance and reporting important asset. Last summer, actually, the Commission mentioned for the first time that capital held by institutional investors will be linked to ESG in the future. So that's really a first big change in a sense, and measures the importance of ESG in the future. Different regions are indeed looking at their own taxonomy guidelines. However, investors are international. So even like even if in the MENA region guidelines at the moment are softer, they still have investors from different places in the world, and they need to provide their investors with data so that these investors can report according to the law that they have to fulfill, in a sense. So what matters in the end will be whether the data will be audited, and also whether there will be estimation would be allowed on this data. So these are the frameworks which change from one region to another, I think.
Thank you, Mariam. That's very helpful. So moving on to Michael, bringing Michael's perspective into the context of the discussion. What are the impacts and benefits of mandatory ESG disclosure? How have you seen this impact on ESG disclosure on listed companies within your own markets that S&P reports on in terms of data? Michael?
Yes, thank you, Marwa. And it's a pleasure to be here. And already, hearing the speakers before me, I think the framework for this question has been set. We've talked about what's happening around the world, and we've talked about the rapid uptake in ESG, and certainly the focus on climate change. The markets that I'm thinking of when I think about the regulators, the mandatory reporting has been announced, and these markets are reacting to what is a future mandatory reporting requirement. And it's different in different markets. So in some markets, it's focused on the companies, large companies and financial institutions, and in other markets, such as New Zealand, for instance, whereas in other markets like Hong Kong, the initial focus has been on investors. To answer your question directly, I'm going to refer to results from a paper that I contributed to, which is the Investor Group on Climate Change paper, a group that is Pacific focused. It has an Asia Pacific version, the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change, and there's an Investor Group on Climate Change in Europe as well. And this, for the audience's sake, this is a group that brings together investors who are concerned about climate change, and there's a number of initiatives that come from that. But in this paper, I identified three areas that focus on companies directly, benefits, if you like, what the impact is from that enhanced ESG disclosure, and it's around the access to capital, greater access to capital for companies, greater access to markets, and overall in the longer term, greater profitability through more sustainable practices. This comes from the organization having a more robust strategy. So one of the key things to keep in mind here when we talk about mandatory disclosure, enhanced ESG disclosure, this is not a tick the box approach. This isn't a company that says, oh, my stakeholders are requiring me to report. This is about a company who is concerned around the future costs, the future impacts of climate change on their organization, and concerned about their ability to hire talent, to maintain and retain that talent, to reduce their health and safety fatalities and lost time injury rates, to have stronger governance. These are the reasons that ESG has rapidly become part of the discussions at the board and C-suite of companies. It's not just a person sitting within an organization that's isolated and has responsibility for sustainability. This is a global phenomena, and as we say, it's not just a risk-focused analysis. There are opportunities here, opportunities to provide products and services that are better aligned to a rapidly changing economy, a rapidly changing global economy that from a climate change perspective is decarbonizing. Notice that I said stakeholders as well, not just investors, because multiple stakeholders are interested in the enhanced ESG disclosures from companies. It's as well as the investors. Here we're talking about exchanges and regulators, but remember that this is about the customers of those companies as well. One of the conversations that I have often is about supply chain risk, because as companies want to improve their ESG profile, they're also looking at their supply chain, especially when they're focused on targets that are emissions reductions targets. And so, overall, the benefit to the stakeholders from this enhanced ESG disclosure is a standardization of the reporting. And it was mentioned already in this panel that we're bringing together these global standards. Greater transparency and a focus on impact as well as risk will lead to better informed decisions around investment, but also around the relationships these companies have, the partnerships they have with their business-to-business organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. You're right. I mean, ESG should be managed just like any other risk that the company may face, as well as an angle or as an anchor to differentiate themselves and to reach out to not just their investors, but their wider stakeholder group. Mariam, can you add to what Michael has just said and putting that into the context of ratings, Mariam?
Yeah, actually, I have a few addings. So the first one is actually a research paper done by Philip Kruger from the University of Geneva, and yes, they demonstrated that it's very beneficial for investors and companies that ESG is mandatory. But the fact that it's mandatory as well, that the reporting is mandatory, showed that it forces the companies to dig into their processes and to make them better, which is like obvious in a sense, and and so the companies are more resilient on the long term. So that's research supports what you just said, Michael. So it's good that we have ESG mandatory today, but there are still many issues, I would say, with ESG scorings and ESG data in general. So what we see is that companies are struggling to collect the data. When they manage to do it, they don't do it in a consistent and similar way. They don't have the same resources to do it. When we look at data generated by data providers, there is a measurement issue. For example, there's academic research that calculated the correlation between different data providers on the same data set, and the correlation is are 54%. I'm mentioning the aggregate confusion series of articles by Florian Bert. The last issue is the frequency of the data. So when we have ESG data today, we think that we're measuring what's happening now, but sometimes actually we're looking at what happened 6 months to a year and a half ago. So this is like very complex, because we cannot do proper integration of ESG in markets, because market value is the discount over forward, and we cannot do predictions with just one point over time. So this is the first issue, but I believe personally that this will be solved at least partially with the regulation, with ISSB and IFRAG coming into place. So all these accounting frameworks. The second observation is about the diversity of investors' opinions, because in fact, investors, what they do is that they buy data from data providers, they calculate their own ESG scores, but these are like proprietary scores and nobody knows them. So in a sense, companies today, they don't have market feedback on how they are perceived from an ESG point of view. And that's something actually we are trying today to capture. So we're asking investors to contribute their proprietary ESG scores on a confidential basis, and we're recreating the market distribution for ESG for each company. So providing ESG analytics for corporates to enhance their corporate and social responsibility strategies. And on the other side, for asset managers to benchmark their ESG strategy and scoring models, and to get also trading signals. And we're using the data to put in place research on ESG integration. So yeah, these are like, in order to move forward with the ESG, there's a real need for more transparency and engagement, beyond the regulation.
Thank you, Mariam. Diana, from your perspective as an R consultant, what are the compliance-related matters or compliance-related areas that companies should consider in preparing mandatory ESG disclosure requirements, particularly if you put it in the context of MENA, Diana?
Yes, I think here, going back to the points that both William and Mariam highlighted is the importance for companies to take a step back and think beyond the disclosure requirements and really conduct a materiality assessment that is relevant for their company and their sector, and marry that with the frameworks that are in place, and also with the stakeholder engagement, and in this case, the investor engagement, to understand what are the issues that they're looking at within their sector and within their company. So when it comes to the areas that they should focus on, it's very important for companies and something that we support issuers with, to develop a framework that is unique to them. And then marry that with the frameworks that are in place to ensure that they're reporting on a consistent basis, and going to Mariam's point, to ensuring that the data is accessible and on an ongoing basis. And here the most important maybe challenge to overcome is that internal capacity from a resource perspective, to ensure that companies are looking at setting up teams internally to monitor that data, to ensure that that engagement framework is in place, to really look at ESG more holistically, rather than just look at the end product of an ESG report. or an ESG data sheet.
Thanks, Diana. Again, looking into the MENA perspective, Michael, what are the key regulatory aspects that are common in MENA markets which have been restricting mandatory ESG disclosures on company vis-a-vis, for example, in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, thanks, Marwa. Look, I don't think that there's a particular indicators. As we've seen, there are initiatives across the region to promote climate change reporting, especially, and ESG reporting. And it makes sense because they're both global concerns. Climate change impacts everyone and everything everywhere. It will change the way we live. It will change the way companies operate. And the same perspective, I often get asked, should we look at different markets in different ways through an ESG lens? And my starting point is always, well, do we value a human life differently depending on where they live? And the answer to that should be no, right? So we should be looking through the same lens when we're analyzing these companies. And if anything, what might be restricting the development is the rapid uptake of ESG, the rapid adoption, the rapid importance of ESG and climate change. These are material issues. We've called it out on this panel already, and material issues need to be addressed by companies, often within the corporate law already. And so, these are picked up by the exchanges as well, who want companies to report on material issues. These issues, especially on climate change, are deemed material by central banks around the world. Our countries are at different stage of development and maturity in financial markets, but given the broad stakeholder demand for ESG, we see that there are any restrictions, any limitations are quickly becoming quickly overcome by the benefits of ESG and climate change reporting. And those benefits directly improve the company and, as I said before, provide access to capital. So one of the ways that we're working with companies is through their green and social bond programs, through aligning their activities, their investments with the EU taxonomy. These initiatives are unlocking global capital and providing access to companies in MENA markets. And I just want to come back also to Miriam and Diana's points, because I feel that they're also restricting ESG disclosure potentially. And I'm going to focus on key things they said, and they highlighted good points. And that is that ESG should focus on materiality, and it should also inform ESG strategy. And this is where we've been working with corporates on the corporate sustainability assessment. It's an assessment that companies perform themselves at its best. And this assessment's been done by 20 years, previously with Robeco ESG scores, now with S&P Global. And this is helping inform companies of their ESG strategy. It identifies ways that companies can benefit from ESG, making or dissolving all of those restrictions. And it's not just the big companies, but there's also ways for smaller companies, for the smaller end of the stock exchange listings, and for even private companies to benefit through platforms like the ESG repository, where they can enter in data themselves, and that data can then benefit them. The low correlation to ESG scores, we don't see that as a great concern, and I'm going to put that out here. I don't think that the regulation is going to solve for that difference, because it's essential, if we think about it from an investor perspective, that investors have access to the most rigorous and credible tools to support their decision making. And so, ESG scores, in our view, should not just be looking at risk alone. Many of the scores that we see today are risk-based scores. So if we think about the need for transparent and rigorous ESG scoring, it's essential for market participants in order to evaluate and optimize their social impact. A range of approaches exists today. That's why there's a difference. That's why there's low correlation. And that range of approaches is measuring companies in different ways. While that might be confusing to some, the answer is that the ESG scores are measuring different things. And so, we see that a range of different approaches or methodologies is appropriate and provides more information to stakeholders.
Thank you, Michael. That was very insightful. Now, turning to strategy integration of ESG, how can companies integrate ESG to their broader corporate strategy and better engage with investors on ESG disclosure? Where are we, Diana? What do you think we can expect to do more of, and particularly thinking of our audience today? Diana, if I might ask you to slightly keep it brief, because we have one more question to cover after this discussion.
Absolutely. I think here we've been talking a lot about the frameworks and ratings, but one of the conversations that I would like to highlight is when you actually speak to the asset managers and their investors and ask what they're really looking at is companies that are meaningfully engaging with ESG and showing that desire to look at how they integrate that within their strategy and how to set a framework that is realistic. So what investors are not looking for is companies that are already there, but that they are looking really at what risks their companies have and how they implement plans to get to where they want to be. So here in issuers and stock exchanges in the region shouldn't be discouraged, but actually look at that appetite from the investor stakeholders and see how that can be brought together with frameworks. So there's a lot of impetus from issuers to engage in meaningful ESG plans, and that's very encouraging. And I think what needs to be done here is to ensure that the framework, the supported framework is in place so that they can succeed rather than be excluded from ratings or investment mechanisms.
Thanks, Diana. Mariam, any input on that, on how companies can integrate ESG to a broader corporate strategy?
Michael's comment about the local relation between data providers. I believe actually that in fact this is not a problem at all, because diversity is important and very healthy. We see it in traditional market. We have standardized accounts and all that, but we still have different investors who have different opinions. My point with the local relation is that a company today might have access to the score of a data provider, but it's not the score of the data provider that is driving the money flow. So the consequences of that is that a company might find itself one day in a fund on diversity, and the next day not, and they don't understand why, while they're doing even better efforts. And the point in that is that basically most investors, the way they work, and here I come to the ESG integration from an investor point of view, because that's happening at two levels. One is actually the scoring level, and the way that most of them work is that they do per sector ranking, and they run the scores and they pick the companies that are in the tier one. So basically, if you are not in the fund, it might not mean that you're not doing good, but that some others are doing much better than you. And this information, the market is not captured. So this is, it's important, I think, and for companies to know what investors think of them from an ESG point of view. And getting to the scoring model, so investors, what they do is that, so they buy the data from you, Michael, from other providers. They use most of the time, the ones who have proprietary model, they would choose the indicator. They will run the scores on their whole universe, which is sometimes like 25,000 companies. They would invest in 2,000 companies, and they would give feedback only to 200. So it's not companies, they just don't know what's going on. And this is, what we're trying to do. So we're trying to convince investors that by contributing the data, they contribute to give indirect feedback, not just to all the companies they're investing in, but also to the ones that they are not investing in because they're not eligible. And this negative feedback is actually interesting because it will push the whole market towards more sustainability in a sense. So the second integration, ESG integration part is the valuation model. So some asset managers, what they do is that they will look at the weighted average cost of capital, and they will actually put in a bonus for companies who are scoring well on ESG, for example. Some of them, they will use the beta, but today there's no model for properly integrating ESG into financial markets valuations. And there should be research done on that. This is what we try to provide the data for, yeah.
Thanks, Mariam. If I may bring in William's perspective into the discussion, ESG disclosure in a post-COVID world, from a risk perspective, what are the new policy developments, particularly in light of the next upcoming COP28 event, which is due to be hosted in the UAE in November 23? What's expected of the region collectively, keeping in mind that ESG and climate risk is a risk like any other risk, which needs to be mitigated? It's not a one-off process, it's an ongoing process. What's your take on that, William? Appreciate if you can keep it short, because I want to have a wrap up with all the panelists.
Thank you, Marwa. If you allow me, I'll take it more towards the investment solutions side of things. So we did a study on earning investors' trust, and the results were 76% of institutional investors have interest in ESG, and 70% of retail investors have interest in ESG. So this led to, and as my colleague panelist earlier said, investors are seeking transparency. Investors are seeking quality and reliability. Sorry. They want to understand the methods in which you construct and manage an investment product to stay away, of course, from greenwashing. So they are seeking for the info from the managers to disclose about the ESG approach used in investment products. So this led us to create the first global voluntarily standards for disclosing on ESG. We call it the CFA Institute Global ESG Disclosures Standards. It's only related to investment products to consider the ESG issues and the objectives of these investment strategies. You can apply it to all type of investment vehicles, all asset classes, and it includes all ESG approaches. It can be applied to active and to passive management and to all markets. So we even standardized that to give some external parties the tools to test if those asset managers self-proclaim themselves ESG compliant or not. So this is a standard that is free of charge, available for everyone, but it also gives verifiers the tool to test how much these products are ESG compliant or not. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Since we have a tight time frame, we'll just wrap up. So what we're seeing today is that 2022 is becoming the year in which ESG is not only becoming mainstream, but it starts driving markets a lot more. And the main driver behind that trend is the core part of financial systems globally, i.e. regulatory bodies, central banks. It's becoming more and more focused on topics such as climate change and impact, diversity and inclusion, and social aspects. It's a lot less of a policy-driven in the West, and a lot more being driven by asset managers and financial institutions and how companies can differentiate themselves. While in the MENA region, what we're seeing collectively is that it's more driven by regulatory bodies and central banks. In the near future, we expect that the International Sustainability Standards Board to become the global standard bearer of ESG disclosures. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you had a fruitful discussion. Thank you to our panelists, William, Michael, Diana, and Mariam. Thank you all.